W.B. Yeats, The Assertion of Values. Romanticism in literature, we may say, is the expression of a sensibility deliberately limited, both as regards its objects of interest and the modes of consciousness that it employs. In Yeats's early verse, for example, a narrow range of uncomplicated emotional attitudes is expressed in a technique incapable of variety, force, or subtlety. What is less obvious is that even when, in the interest of a fuller and more abounding life, he had developed a technique of flexible and forceful speech, persistent habits of romantic simplification remained. An example of what I mean can be found in his use of figures from heroic legend. Instead of impossible heroes and languishing queens with cloud-pale eyelids and dream-dimmed eyes, we now have Helen and her boy, Solomon with Sheba planted on his knees, and Leda, that sprightly girl, was trodden by a bird. At first reading, it seems that the purpose served by these and similar phrases is the recreation of the heroic world in modern idiom, the ironic application, in Elizabethan fashion, of old fable to contemporary needs. That perhaps was the intention, but the references also serve a deeper need, a nostalgia for an imagined past in which painful complexities are evaporated. For Mr. McNeice says rightly that Yeats was orientated towards a simplified past. And it is significant that in the poem Ancestral Houses, the irony relies on an absolute acceptance of the past, a haughtier age, and is directed solely against the present. There is no suggestion of the two-way irony which in The Wasteland sets present and past in a clearer light. To romanticize any element in a given situation is to admit an inability to deal with it completely and with a full awareness of all that is involved. And Yeats, even in his middle and later periods, continued to use romantic glamour as an escape from difficult or painful problems. The poem No Second Troy opens in the tones of straightforward speech. Why should I blame her that she filled my days with misery, or that she would of late have taught to ignorant men most violent ways, or hurled the little streets upon the great, had they but courage equal to desire? But from the sixth line the poem draws largely on romantic idealization. What could have made her peaceful with a mind that nobleness made simple as a fire, with beauty like a Titan bow, a kind that is not natural in an age like this, being high and solitary and most stern? And in the end, a woman with whom only difficult relations were possible is transformed into that Helen who exists only for the imagination. Why? What could she have done, being what she is? Was there another Troy for her to burn? In Easter 1916, the refrain, all changed, changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born, represents an escape from full realization. Sometimes, as in the instances just quoted, the nature of the transformation is indicated by a change in diction, a lapse into something like Yeats's earlier manner. At other times, it is half concealed by the assured use of an idiom, professedly non-romantic. Yeats in fact uses his later colloquial technique with such self-confident swagger that often one gives him credit for doing all that he merely claims to do. The speech of Myself, which ends, a dialogue of self and soul, the winding stair, has a sinewy vigor. I am content to live it all again, and yet again, if it be life to pitch into the frog spawn of a blind man's ditch, a blind man battering blind men. But when the poem ends, I am content to follow to its source every event in action or in thought measure the lot, forgive myself the lot. We have no warrant that follow to its source, measure, and forgive myself stand for explorations actually undertaken. And if the poems dealing explicitly with contemporary chaos are, in the long run, disappointing, it is for a similar reason. In Meditations in Time of Civil War and 1919, The Tower, there are memorable lines and striking images. Nothing but grip of claw and the eye's complacency, the innumerable clanging wings that have put out the moon. Violence upon the roads, violences of horses. Herodias' daughters have returned again. A sudden blast of dusty wind, and after, thunder of feet, tumult of images, their purpose in the labyrinth of the wind. But if the success of the poem seems partial and fragmentary, it is because the half-read wisdom of demonic images, which we are told suffice the aging man as once the growing boy, is made to take the place of a deeper understanding. Perhaps the best way of defining the disappointment that one feels on returning to so many of Yeats's poems that had previously seemed deeply moving is to say that they fail to gather strength of life with being, to grow, that is, with one's own developing experience, unlike so much of Eliot's poetry, where each fresh reading brings fresh discovery. For not only does Yeats tend to simplify his problems, there is in much of his poetry a static quality which can be traced to the adoption of certain fixed attitudes in the face of experience. There is a relation, he said, between discipline and the theatrical sense. Active virtue, as distinguished from the passive acceptance of a current code, is therefore theatrical, consciously dramatic, the wearing of a mask. Dramatis personae. But his preoccupation with the mask was not merely a search for a discipline. Sometimes it seems like the rationalization of a self-dramatizing egotism which made him feel happier if he could see himself, Milton's Platonist, in an appropriate light. Consider, for example, his attitude of pride. One can relish his criticism of those who long for popularity that they may believe in themselves, and of poets who want marching feet, and at the same time recognize a danger to sincerity in a too persistent assertion of something steel-like and cold within the will, something passionate and cold. There is a smack of the 90s here, and one remembers his fondness for Dowson's lines. Unto us they belong, us the bitter and gay, wine and women and song. Villanelle of the Poet's Road. Bitter and gay, that is the heroic mood, he wrote in 1935. Like the aristocratic order that he imagined, pride is valued as an assertion of the living spirit confronted with democratic commonness. But there is something unliving in the use he makes of cold and bitter and proud, adjectives that tend to appear with the same regularity as the emblems which, in his later poetry, too often take the place of living metaphor. There is no doubt that the sap flows most freely when the conscious pride is forgotten, remaining only as a temper of mind that is sufficiently assured not to insist on its own firmness. The pose that results from over-insistence is most obvious in admittedly minor poems, like the short sequence Upon a Dying Lady, and those verses that celebrate the discipline of the looking glass, which he seems to have continued to regard as the appropriate discipline for beautiful women. But it also betrays itself in work of greater power. In the third section of the title poem of The Tower, he writes of upstanding men. I declare, they shall inherit my pride, the pride of people that were bound neither to cause nor to state, neither to slaves that were spat on, nor to the tyrants that spat, the people of Burke and of Grattan, that gave, though free to refuse. The rhythm of these lines suggests Tom Moore, rather than the man who wrote the vigorous protest against old age with which the same poem opens. The pride, in short, sometimes seems like another form of the escape from complexity. Referring once more to the mask, he wrote, "I think all happiness depends on the energy to assume the mask of some other self, that all joyous or creative life is a rebirth as something not oneself. We put on a grotesque or solemn painted face to hide us from the terrors of judgment, invent an imaginative saturnalia where one forgets reality, a game like that of a child, where one loses the infinite pain of self-realization." Dramatis Personae. Yeats knew as well as anyone that the infinite pain of self-realization is the price paid for life, and in the lines that he wrote for his epitaph there is a deep and unintended pathos. Cast a cold eye on life, on death, horsemen pass by. Measured by potentiality, by aspiration, and by the achievement of a few poems, it is as a heroic failure that one is forced to consider Yeats's poetic career as a whole. The causes were complex. Something, no doubt, must be attributed to defects of character, and a very great deal must be attributed to the literary tradition of the 19th century, which, as he came to see so clearly, offered the very opposite of an incitement to maturity. But since the death of language is but a part of the tyranny of impersonal things, essays, that tradition itself appears as the symptom of a deeper disease. Yeats wrote of W. E. Henley, "He never understood how small a fragment of our nature can be brought to expression, nor that but with great toil, in a much divided civilization." And of himself as a young man, already half conscious that nothing so much matters as unity of being, "Nor did I understand as yet how little that unity, however wisely sought, is possible without a unity of culture in class or people that is no longer possible at all." Autobiographies. These passages, representative of many others, are part of a diagnosis that is valuable not merely for the light that it throws on Yeats's poetry. For those who would understand our divided and distracted civilization, in which the passionate intensity of partial men offers itself as a substitute for the vitality that springs from the whole consciousness, few things are more profitable than a study of Yeats's poetry and prose together. The mischief, he said, began at the end of the 17th century, when man became passive before a mechanized nature. Introduction to the Oxford Book of Modern Verse.